One of the challenges around the world is you bring the schools to where the communities are. And in many parts of the world, communities are naturally segregated on racial lines, religious lines, economic lines. And so, what communities you do get are sort of reinforcing the environment that they're in because we need to make the schools accessible to kids in a local community. But they may not get an exposure to somebody from a different background or a different religion or a different race or a different economic, socioeconomic background. That may not happen for some until they go to college, if they go to college. So, what are some of the things you've seen that either work internationally, maybe things that you've been part of consulting for, that give kids in that sort of elementary through middle school, high school level, the opportunity to see across different peer groups, even though that may not be innate to the school that they attend or even to the neighborhood that they live in?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's a tough one because, yeah, I mean, I live on the northern beaches of Sydney, which is called the Insular Peninsula because it is very insular and there's not many people from outside of here because it's a wealthy area and it's on the beaches and there's a lot of surfers and a lot of people who like to live in houses that look over the water. So it's something that I worry about with my own kids. I think one of the things that I've seen work really well is there's an organisation called Upschool.co, and they organise for schools, primary schools and high schools, but for groups within the school to raise funds to build a library or a school for a less fortunate area. And it can either be a less fortunate area in their country or in another country. And so they organise that. But part of that is actually getting to know the kids in that other school as well. So they're not just raising funds to actually build a library, they're also raising funds. They're also spending time talking to the kids and talking to the teachers in those schools about what they actually need and how they live their lives and how they get to school and all those things which are really important for that as well. And I think that's a really cool way to actually enable kids to have a more varied education, or at least experiences outside of their normal school. And they have a lot of other programs as well around that. And so I think that's a cool way to do it. If you can have some setup where the school that's in a wealthy area can have a sister or brother school in another area which is poorer, and they can have some sort of link between the two. But it needs to be real and it needs to go both ways. I have seen where there's been, well-to-do schools and they've set up a situation like that, and then they've had scholarships and they've brought kids in to their school, and that doesn't work because these kids they feel, out of place, right? It's like I'm all of a sudden in this wealthy school that I've never seen. They've got a pool and they've got blur and they've got gym and all the rest of it. I come from this other school over the other side of town that doesn't have any of these things, and it can work occasionally, but it's much harder. And so it really needs to be both ways. And you really need to have that relationship going both ways if you're going to make that work. But it is really important. And it's also important that we realise that things like racism, for example, which is a huge issue in a lot of societies, it's a huge issue in all societies, because our brains have actually set up in a way, it didn't evolve to be racist, but it actually ends up that way because of the way societies are set up. So our face template, which is in our fusiform face area, part of our brain, it's actually the way we identify who people are is based on this template, which is actually a matching system. Because all our faces are very similar, it's hard to actually identify each individual. That template is actually an average of all the faces we see. And so we know that if you see a real varied number of faces from lots of different races, your face template is much wider than somebody who sees the one race all the time. Now, the issue is that we all grow up in families where it's the same race, because it's got to be the same race, right? And so the face that we see most is our race to begin with. And then that often continues because often we're associated with the same race mainly. And so our face template is usually strongly biased towards our race. Now, that face template actually determines what we orient to and what we actually recognize most easily. So when somebody comes into a room and they're of a different race, we automatically orient to them because of that face template. Because that face template says that's not a person who's an average of your face template. It's different. It deviates from that. So you've got to orient to that person because they're a member of your out group, even though they may not be a member of your out group, even though you might know them. So you orient to them really quickly, and that sets off your fight or flight response, which increases your heart rate. We also don't recognize somebody who's more deviates more from that face template, from our average, which means we don't recognize people from other races as well, and we're more likely to misidentify people from other races. So we're going to orient to somebody who's not the average of our faces, and we're going to misidentify them later on, which causes a lot of issues in society. So we know countries where they mainly see the same race, such as Japan, have the worst cases of racism than any other country in the world because of that template, because the template is really, really narrow, and therefore they're always, have a negative response, that response to faces which aren't part of that template. Whereas more homogeneous societies, where there's more variation, you have a more wide template, and therefore you don't have those responses in the same way. So what we need to do is everybody needs to be looking at lots and lots of different faces, and it will actually dampen down that face template. It'll actually make it much wider. So we're not having those automatic responses that we don't realize we're having. This isn't something that you're conscious of. So therefore you need to actually perceive lots and lots of faces, and that will actually help dampen down that automatic response that we have in our face template.